So, hi to all the marketing folks tuning in to the very first episode of What's in an Ad, where we find experts to tell us why, where, and how AI tools belong in the future of marketing and advertising. Today, we're specifically going to be looking at what the ideal tech stack looks like when it comes to ad analytics. So, I'm Swagam, I'm the co founder of Pint AI. Think of Pint as your GPS for better creative performance. You give us your goal, be it ROAS, CTR, and let Pint figure out what are the best routes to get there by optimizing your creative. And today we're super lucky to be joined by Matthew. He's the senior manager of growth marketing at Ampush. It's a Tinuiti company. And thanks so much for being here, Matthew.
Yeah, of course.
So, Matthew, would you like to tell your story first, right? Tell our viewers, what is it that you do? And one very important question as well, along with that, right? What excites you or scares you the most about the future of AI tools in marketing?
Yeah, so very brief intro. I live in New York City. I have been in the industry for about 4 years now. And, I think speaking to that point of what scares me about the industry is even starting 4 years ago, the industry has completely changed, right? Like, I think we went from a place where, if we're talking specifically about Meta, where your bid cap or your cost cap, like the way you optimize with your bids or the way that you like are targeting with specific audiences, that's changed immensely. Those are no longer levers like they used to be. And I would say like the push to AI on Meta has been tremendous, right? Like you have Advantage Plus campaigns. The way that you just throw a bunch of creative in and don't look back is very different than how we used to think about it. So yeah, I would say that AI has changed the way that we're thinking about the industry so that, a lot of the time we're focused a lot more on certain levers like creative. And that's where a lot of our energy is going.
Amazing. It's great to hear that, especially the creative plug. But one thing that's really, that's always going to remain there, right, when it comes to performance marketing or at least advertising in general, is that at the end, it's also a big data game, right? And if it's a
Yeah,
big data game, it's also a big analytics game. So
absolutely.
if that's the question, I just want to get your thoughts before you move into the tech stack, saying how are you looking at, analytics changing or evolving to make your life better as a marketer?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of analytics evolving, there's a lot of ways to approach that question, right? I think there's all types of improve data visualizations, right? I think so much of the issue of, and not specifically AI, but just in general, I think like one of the biggest challenges is just having all the right data in front of you to make a decision, right? There's
Hmm.
so many like disparate sources of data. And being able to connect those and create a story, whether you're connecting like Facebook with GA data or whatever it is so critical, right?
Yep.
Um, so that's one element for sure. But in terms of the other elements of like how can what improved tools will come around, right? I think it really is those types of tools that are ingesting all types of data. And I know, like for example, we have Pint AI, for example, that is going to be doing that. But there's also other tools like another similar one is Motion, right? Like Motion in the sense of like that's something that our team currently leverages that didn't exist a couple years ago. And the way that we think through that and get creative insights and how that informs our future decisions is like something that we wouldn't even have thought of a couple years ago.
Absolutely. I completely agree with you. Things are, I mean, maybe there are about 1,000 MarTech tools that are coming out every quarter at this point, right?
Right.
Each of them have a new offering at the same time. So, speaking about that, because there's so many functions, right, when it comes to your analytics in itself, um, how would you go about what are the core components, right? How would you go about identifying these core components that every ad analytics tech stack should ideally have?
Yeah, before the interview, I actually thought a little bit about this. Of like, I think we can break it down into almost like three different categories. Um, I think category number one is kind of what I said before, is data visualization, right? Like, I think that is one of the biggest problems. And even to this day, when I onboard a new client, I think through like, what can we do to make this easier so we can have all the data in one place and make easier decisions? Point two is really just getting tools to better understand the customer journey. I think it's really helpful for me to think of it as almost like just thinking through every step of the funnel, right? So like from the very top, right, we're talking about creative tools. When someone sees the ad, right, and you think about what tools can I employ to better understand how someone is interacting with this ad, or what type of ad is going to get across the finish line. Obviously, we have Facebook data or whatever data platform we're on, but there are obviously things like Motion or Pint AI that'll help us better understand what's going on. And then moving down the funnel, once you get onto your landing page, using heat maps like Hotjar or Microsoft Clarity to better understand like how are people actually engaging with my landing page? Are people scrolling? Are people clicking in a certain place? Should I be changing how I'm messaging things based on how people are interacting with the page? And obviously, if you have your right pixel set up, you can also see how long people are engaging with your page or where they're dropping off. And those things are critical to just create a more like unified flow. And even after that, right? Once people convert, you need to think through if we're looking like beyond that for like retention, right? Getting your HubSpots, your Salesforces set up so that you can re-engage with folks and understand the effectiveness of your efforts. So I would definitely say that that's a critical part. The final thing that I would say is, and I think this is the most important thing for ad analytics, is, and one of the biggest issues with marketing in general, right, is like your attribution and measurement, right?
Yes,
And
absolutely.
there are so many things and that's definitely the final bucket and the most challenging one, especially with the changing world, like the changing ecosystem. And I think, even since I began working a couple years ago, the way that we think about it is completely different, right? I think when we first started, people were talking about, Google Analytics, like that should be your source of truth, in the sense of like, that's the last touch. But then you realize like, that's not the entire story, right? People are probably interacting with a lot of different channels before they end up converting, right? So like a last click solution like Google Analytics shouldn't be your only source of truth, right? That's why I think when we're thinking about a tech stack, trying to get other sources of truth or things to help guide you in the right direction, whether that's a post-purchase survey or working with like MMM solutions, like those types of things are going to be critical in helping guide you to what is the actual effectiveness of my marketing. And even then, right, like thinking through like different types of tests and setup, like holdout tests, incrementality tests, brand lift studies, right? These things are going to be critical to actually understanding what is the impact of my ads on a specific channel actually having.
I really want to start off with the last one that you
Right,
said,
right, right.
the most important one. And I've heard this everywhere, which is the source of truth. And how can someone actually even go about identifying what their source of truth is today, right? I mean, I know it's obviously a difficult question, and because I don't think there is one. But how would you go about judging what should be my source of truth, at least for my next 6 months, to be able to make an effective campaign?
So I think some of the things that are the most, like, obviously one of the most difficult things is to establish, like, right, yeah, exactly. Like Facebook is telling me one thing, GA thing might be telling me another thing, my MMM might say something completely different, right? And I think especially for people who are starting out or like their business is very new, right? Like there are certain things like an MMM, for example, is very expensive, right? And typically takes a lot of time and a lot of data. And sometimes when you need to make real time decisions, right, like you can't do that.
Yes.
and especially if you're like pretty low budget or new. So I mean, I think my general advice and what I tend to look for is, especially if you're not spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on Facebook or whatever it is, because even then, right, like to do brand incrementality studies or stuff like brand lift studies, pardon, that takes hundreds of thousands of dollars of Facebook spend to do. And I think in the meantime, it is, I mean, you have to make some educated guesses, right? Like Facebook is telling me one thing, and it feels, I'm seeing, like, if I increase Facebook spend, sometimes I might be seeing some increases in purchases or whatever your KPI is. And then, trying to corroborate that with GA and even another tool that really isn't that expensive is probably also a post-purchase survey, right? Where it's like you actually like reach out to people once they purchase and be like, hey, where did you actually hear about us, right? Because obviously if their first touch is going to be like super critical there. So yeah, I mean, I know that wasn't a great answer in a lot of ways, but I think the point is that it's hard, right? And every company, every business problem is a little bit different. And I think even the behavior of, like, for example, if you have a product that's at like a much lower price point, people are probably going to make that purchase more impulsively, right? And like that would mean that you can probably rely a little bit more on a last click solution like GA than you could on like other types of clients, like a high price point product, say like, a couple hundred US dollars for the purchase, right? Like people are going to take going to take some time to make that decision, right? So I think it really depends on who your client is and like their specific business problem.
No, that last point was extremely, extremely interesting, right? Because at the end of the day, I mean, I knew while asking the question that this is not something which has a direct answer. One,
Right.
because it's not a one size fits all solution, and because we actually never know where the source of truth is coming from, because we don't know where the leakage is coming from, right? At the
That's
end of the
also
day,
true. Yes.
right? So it was. Yeah, it was a bit of a trick question that I asked, but at the same time, a very important one because that's the first thing everybody thinks about. But one thing that I really got from what you said is that a large part of a marketer's efforts is in being flexible, right? Making a change in the thought process, be it the source of truth or be it in terms of your actual variables that you're putting out while making a campaign or an ad set, right? So how much of that translates into customization when it comes to these tools that you're looking at, right? What are the areas that you think are essential for customization across tools?
Yeah. No, I think it's interesting. I mean, I think as you mentioned, right, there is no one size fit all.
Yep.
And even the fact, like currently I'm a couple clients, and even there's like their tech stacks are vastly different because of the needs of what they're looking for, right? And I think like I have one client that is more like in the event space, so their objective is to sell as many tickets as they can to events around the United States.
Okay.
And even just like their source of truth is ticketure, right? Like actually getting like real tickets. Like that is their source of truth, and what it says in there is what we're going to base our decisions on. And that's very different than one of my other companies, right, that uses something like Shopify, right? And even just like the end all, like how are we defining our performance is very different depending on what the marketing problem is. But in terms of like customization, I mean it's a real trick question. It's a real trick question, and I mean, and it's one of those things where I think one of the hardest things is like one of my clients, for example. There's one of those things where it's like there are so many things that I would recommend for their tech stack, and I think one of the problems they're having is that they don't have a lot of staffing, right? They don't have a lot, and maybe not a lot of resources, right? And I think a piece of advice I give is like there are certain parts of your tech stack that you should, I think, so many growth marketers or marketers in general should prioritize. And one of my clients does not prioritize, for example, something like CRM or email, right? It's basically free, right?
Yeah.
And they have not created a strong strategy behind it. So like in terms of like, I think I think there's a lot of buzz around some things like, like as we mentioned, right? The analytics pieces, and trying to figure out what types of analytics are going to get me over the finish line. But I think there are some things that should always be constant, right? And for example, like I see one of my clients without a strong CRM strategy, and I'm like, that just feels like a gimme. You have to
Yeah.
develop that. So yeah, I mean, I don't know if that exactly answered your question, but hopefully that moves us in the right direction.
I mean, it definitely does because it automatically shows us that there is somewhat of a priority when it comes to this tech stack, right?
Yes, absolutely, there
And
is.
getting to that priority is, I think, the most important question at the end of the day. The reason why I'm saying it is because there's so many tools and each
Yes,
do a different thing, right? It's maybe many times they're not competing against another one. All of them are complementing each other, but at the same time, you have to choose, right, which one to use for your own use case. So,
that's
any
right.
words of advice on this question, right? Prioritizing based on your use case, and how would you go about doing that? And another one, I'm just going to sneak it in with that, is that prioritizing while taking into account integrations, because I see that to be a big
Mm.
thing, right?
Yeah, I'll actually start with that second point or that last point you made about the integrations. I think like that is one way where, for example, if we're going to narrow in on Facebook,
Hmm.
changed a lot over the last couple of years, right? We have like the conversions API integration, for example, where basically it just takes in data that you're driving in your source of truth, whether that's Salesforce or HubSpot or wherever it is, or Shopify, um, and it feeds that data back to Facebook so that Facebook can better optimize, drive higher, like, higher quality users that actually want to, or who are more likely to achieve the KPI that you have set. Um, and I think like that is one of the ways where automation and the technology change has been essential, right? I think Cappy, for example, or Conversions API, just installing that
Yeah.
drives up your conversion rate by like, I don't know, 10, 20, 30% in some cases.
Oh,
Uh,
wow.
yeah, no, it's like a very powerful tool, right? To give Facebook more signal.
Wow.
So, I mean, I think that's one of those things where it's like they're all, and to your point, right? Like in that, I think you said at the end of the last question, right? Like all of these items are all these things are working together, right? Like you want to make your tech stack complement each other, because once you do integrate, right? Like there is a lot of signal all that data is being shared and fed to the algorithms to help drive better performance for you. Um, I actually forget what the question. What was the first part of the question?
No,
Um,
I think you answered based on this itself, right? It's showing that integration is something to prioritize because you
yes,
want it to connect at the end of the day, right? You want them to be complementary to each other.
yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think that's exactly right, right? I mean, you definitely do. And in terms of prioritization, right? Obviously, the key question is like what is going to help you drive the most revenue? And that's always like the key question. Sometimes it's murky, right? And I think that's why like for example, using that example of like it's so important to have a strong email, SMS, CRM system because we all know as marketers that it's cheaper to retain a client than to acquire a new one.
Always,
Um,
yeah.
right. So that's one element. And two, it's basically free, right? Other than your time and effort that you're putting in, it's free to do. So it's just one of those things that's just like an absolute no brainer. Um, but there's other things where you're thinking about revenue or you're thinking about where it becomes a little murky, right? And but that it's you know better understanding the customer journey, right? Getting to that point about like yeah, your tech stacks to support that, right? if you can better understand your customer journey, you can better understand where you should invest your dollars to drive your revenue.
Absolutely. Now, on that point, it was coming, right? If you tell me better understand your customer journey,
Right.
how how would you suggest that marketers today go about it? And we can take any example, right? Be it the e-commerce, D2C space, because obviously it's varied. But how do you think you can get to that point? The reason I'm asking is because I've also seen many times marketers say that customer journey is important, and customer personas, etc. They are important, but
Right.
you can get lost in them,
You
right?
absolutely can.
Yes. So in that context, where do you know that this is where to end an experiment and keep that loop running, right? To understand them more.
Right. I mean, I think the easiest answer for that, right, is just very deliberate testing,
Amazing.
right? Very deliberate testing. And, I think that's, frankly, we're on your podcast talking about Pint AI, right? That's where Pint AI is useful, right? In the sense of, it has all these insights of understanding like what is going to actually help push someone down the funnel, right? Like what's actually going to appeal to people and move them through. But, let's say that Pint AI doesn't exist for a second, right? And
Hmm.
we're taking a step back and we're thinking about like, how do you actually deliberately test like the customer journey or what types of things are going to, you know, like push people down the funnel. And, for example, my team, like if we're trying to use what we like to do, what we call informal testing, which is really just like you have, let's say you have five creative, they all look exactly the same except for one small element. Say like you are testing different value prompts, and you have like a creative showing your product, and then you have just like for on all five, you've just like they're slightly different value prompts, but every otherwise it's exactly the same. And you see which one wins out, right? And
Yep.
you better understand, right? Like what types of messages are going to work with people, and resonate most with people. So, for example, I have a subscription meat box as one of my former clients. And through this type of testing, we were like, wow, for some reason, talking about the like not going to the grocery, like not needing to go to the grocery store messaging is just absolutely crushing. And it's one of those things like we figure out like, you know, you figure that messaging is going to beat almost everything else. And then, you go down this route of like, okay, if that messaging works, let's think about why that works, right? It's really leaning into this convenience aspect. It's leaning into this, like, yeah, like ease of life. Of maybe is it the delivery element that's, and like you go down this rabbit hole of like, okay, now I have new things to test and more ways to figure out how are we gonna get this to our creative to resonate with our audiences. And you can do very similar things with like landing page testing as well, where it's like,
Yep.
straight up, just like, you know, how you can do formal A/B tests on Facebook, or just like more informal ones where it's like, all right, let's see where our spend goes, and let's see how people are interacting with our pages and how the funnel shapes are different,
Hmm.
especially with creative too, right? Like understanding like, this creative was really clicky, but like it didn't really get a lot of people to convert. Maybe this is just clickbait, right? And that's the importance of having strong analytic ability to tell a story with the data that you're driving, right? And with the data that you're receiving, and make strong decisions off of that and strong hypotheses as to what you should do next.
That's amazing because I just wanted to figure out how do we get to the creative part, right? Because that seems to be such uh, a big problem in today's day and age. Why I say this is because across the board, even Google mentions, right? 70% of a campaign success is based on the creative. Only 30 is media placement, and
Right.
it's I mean, it's amazing to hear because automatically you just assume, if they've placed it on someone's feed, it's there for a reason, and that's true. But whether they click on it or not, well, that's purely up to you and what you decide to show to them, right? And that relationship, that if it's done right, that's when you see the highest ROAS, highest click-through rate, and things like that, right?
Right.
So just on that basis, since we've already, come on the creative part, I just want to quickly go through each of the parts of the funnels that you mentioned, right? When you say the
Right.
first part of the funnel, right? And let's assume the first part of the funnel's only job is what? Push them down the funnel, right?
Right. Get them to
So
click.
exactly.
Yeah.
So in this part, what are the types of tools that you would recommend that people actually really think about and try to figure out, right? Starting from could be creative analysis or anything else, optimization tools.
Right. Well, the first thing, is like having a creative agency, or if you have the privilege of working with your own creative, that's a tool in and of itself, right?
Oh,
Like
yeah.
being able to pump out assets really quickly, or assets, as I mentioned, right? Like if you want to be very deliberate, assets that are similar to each other, and that are just slight iterations, and then you can develop learnings from there. And it requires you to be very deliberate. I think the only caution, right, is like creative testing becomes a lot easier the higher the budget you have, right? Um,
Absolutely.
and I think that's if you're only spending, say, like, even if you're spending less than $5,000-$10,000 of ad spend a day, right? Especially if you don't want to devote your entire account to creative testing, then it becomes difficult, or it can become difficult. And you have to be very deliberate about, like, maybe I can't test this way. I have to take way bigger swings when I test, which is something, right? Like, we don't have, even on my clients, we don't have the luxury of a limited budget, right? But I would say that there are definitely tools here. I think one of the most important tools is like is the Facebook platform, or the platform that you're on, right? Like that is going to tell you a story about what's going on, especially if you have your events pixeled throughout the entire funnel, all the way from click to purchase. If you have your add to carts, or like initiate checkouts, you can better understand, like, how are people engaging at each step, and how is my creative helping me get there. So that, I mean, like, being able to actually figure out what the story is so essential to help figure out, like, okay, how do we move down the line, and how do we iterate from here. But then, obviously, quick plug for Pint AI, right? And the motions of the world, right? Like there are tools to actually understand, oh, like what are the actual creative elements that are, driving performance or driving the KPIs that I'm seeking. And those are critical types of tools, especially, and those are, as we mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, like newer tools to help understand how users are behaving with your ads. So that's starting from the creative level.
So now, suppose you have done enough creative testing, right? And the problem with creative testing today, like you'd mentioned, is it's a costly process at the end of the day. So
Yeah.
instead of, you don't want there to be 100 creatives that you put out and one or two are, winners, right? Instead, you want to reduce that number, get it to like 15, 10, maybe even the two that you put out, one is going to be a winner, right? And
Right.
that's where these element tracking tools come into play. But what happens after that, right? Suppose you've gotten them through that part of the funnel. What next?
Yeah, right. I mean, I think a lot of the time, from my general take is that sometimes people are really focused just on the platform, right? On everything that goes into Facebook. But that's only half of the journey, right? When you're thinking about the journey to purchase, right? The landing page that you have is so important. And we talked about some tools earlier. I think, like, you have your heat mapping tools, that help you understand how are people actually engaging with your page. Are there any places where people are like rage quit clicking, or places that are causing a lot of, I guess, frustration amongst people? That's important to understand, right? And it's pretty nuts. I've seen, like, even the inclusion of certain buttons, or where you place them, or like changing your hero image, or even like what information is at the top of your page, can vastly change how people are interacting with your page, and really lead to incredible conversion rate gains. So I would say that heat mapping tools like Hotjar are essential.
Hmm.
Here at Ampush/Tinuiti, we use a tool called Mixpanel. So
Okay.
Mixpanel is, it can very easily track what is the actual behavior on the site, right? Like once again, have put it instead of a heat map, actually putting numbers to where people are clicking, or how long someone is interacting with a certain part of the funnel, and very clearly tracking like, yeah, what are the different stages of the funnel and how are people interacting with it, and yeah, that type of data is one that my story is a lot of people are not incredibly focused on when there's so much buzz around like the platform itself.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the major talking points, right? That there's so much going on in just one platform. It's difficult to know when to just stop with that platform
Yeah,
and look at the rest.
yeah,
um, so that's itself fascinating. And I think the third, I mean, down onwards, right? When you're going into retargeting, etc., that's
right.
when you'd already mentioned about the types of tools, right? Where you want to get surveys sorted out. We want to also have pop-up tools even, right? At
Yeah, right.
the landing
Huge.
pages.
There's so many tools that's like, even tools, and I can't think of any off the top of my head right now, where it's like you scroll over to the X and you have pop-ups
Yes,
that come up, right? And those types of tools are I like there to your point, there are so many tools in the tech stack that you can employ, and some of these tools are, there's even like, I forget the name. I was reading about this recently, like cross-selling tools, where it's like, you buy something on, for example, a D2C client, and it knows that like, oh, because you bought this as a buying this D2C product, you're probably going to be interested in these other D2C products. And it'll show that once you purchase, right? Like there are just so many tools out there that you can employ to help drive incremental conversions, right? It's just a matter of like, where do you prioritize it, right?
exactly. And I think one thing that I really got from you at the end of the day was you can prioritize it if you're able to, one, have something like a mixed panel, etc., which allows you to then say, okay, for this part of the funnel, this did really amazing. For this part of the funnel, this did not work out, right?
Right.
That is the key at the end of the day. For
Yeah.
separated out by the funnels, and then for each funnel, understand what's the most important part, right? And then go on. Am I right in saying that as an assumption from everything that you
Yeah,
said?
no, I agree. And what's hard though is like, I think the one thing that is difficult, and I'll push back on slightly, is like, and I think that's what makes growth marketing so difficult, is every part of the funnel is interconnected, right? Like,
Yes.
and I think like even the creative that you use, it seems counterintuitive, but the creative that you use is going to affect what happens post click as well, right? And I think that's the only place I would push back, where it's like sometimes it all works in one giant funnel, right? Not in like this is like the Facebook part of the funnel, the landing page part of the funnel, right? Like it's one big funnel.
I mean, I absolutely agree. Yes,
Yeah,
it's you can't miss the forest for the trees type of a system, right? But at the same time, each individual aspect is also something that's worth
that's
looking at.
very true.
So, I mean, that's why it's science plus it's art, and that's why it's exciting at the end of the day. So, I mean, thanks so much, Matthew. I don't think there's any other question that I have as of now, but in case other viewers come in, I will be sure to put them your way or get some other questions answered. But thanks so much for being here and for all the advice that you've given us and for speaking so highly about all the different tools that you've seen out there as well as Pint AI.
Of course. Yeah. Thank you for your time. And happy to help any way I can.